It was the middle of a heat wave when the first lightning cracked through the sky, but that wasn't what made Marcus's phone buzz urgently against his desk. No, it was the motion sensor alert from his storm shelter, the one hidden discreetly under a patch of fake lawn in his backyard. The alert wasn't normal. It wasn't storm debris or a raccoon. The shelter's camera sent a live feed to Marcus's screen, and there she was, Karen from the HOA, flashlight in hand, bolt cutters dangling from one wrist, standing inside his shelter wide-eyed like she had just stumbled into Area 51. And then it happened. The shelter's door thunked shut behind her with a mechanical hiss, the biometric locks engaging, trapping her 3 feet underground as the approaching thunderstorm howled overhead. Marcus couldn't help but chuckle in disbelief. Karen, who had spent months lecturing him about neighborhood harmony and compliance with HOA aesthetics, had broken into his federally funded emergency shelter, and now she was locked inside it, panicking like a cat caught in a trap. For a brief, hilarious, and almost cinematic moment, Marcus wondered if he should just grab a bag of popcorn and enjoy the unfolding show. Rewinding the last few hours in his mind, Marcus couldn't deny the whole mess had been building up for months. Ever since he installed the storm shelter, Karen had been pestering him with letters and passive-aggressive HOA notices, claiming it was a visual nuisance, even though it was completely underground and invisible unless you knew where to look. Marcus, an aerospace systems engineer, had gone through all the permits and approvals years ago, including getting disaster mitigation grants that made his setup almost government-grade. But Karen, self-declared president of the HOA, wasn't about facts or legality. She was about control. In her mind, if she hadn't approved it, it shouldn't exist. And today, armed with hearsay, a cheap flashlight, and a dangerously overinflated ego, she had decided to enforce her own brand of vigilant justice. Earlier that day, Marcus had been sitting at his favorite cafe, working remotely, when he noticed Karen and 2 of her sidekicks lurking around his backyard on the home security app. He figured they were up to another one of their surprise inspections, which usually amounted to little more than peeking over fences and pretending to take notes on clipboards. He had smirked, texted a couple of neighbors about the Karen patrol, and gone back to his cappuccino, thinking nothing more of it. After all, what could they really do? The shelter was protected both by law and about a dozen electronic safeguards he had installed himself for peace of mind. Little did he know that today, Karen intended to escalate far beyond passive aggressiveness. The first mistake Karen made was thinking she could open a door designed to withstand F5 tornadoes with dollar store bolt cutters. What she didn't realize was that the storm shelter's emergency entrance had a tamper detection system. If anyone tried to manually force the hatch, the system would automatically unlock the hatch for 30 seconds, long enough for someone to scramble inside, but then lock down permanently until manually reset from the interior console. It was a system built for survival, not snooping, and now Karen was learning that lesson the hard way. Inside the shelter, Karen's first few moments of victory quickly turned into panic. She had thought it would be a simple open and shut, sneak inside, take a few damning photos of unauthorized construction, and send them to the HOA's lawyer. But the shelter was nothing like she imagined. It wasn't some dark, muddy hole. It was a high-tech marvel lit with emergency LEDs, lined with stock shelves, and equipped with cameras, sensors, and heavy-duty automated systems. Her flashlight swung wildly as she looked around, heart hammering faster than the approaching storm winds outside. She turned back toward the hatch, only to hear the gut-dropping sound of mechanical locks sliding into place. Karen tried the door. She pulled, she pushed, she even kicked it with her flip-flop-clad foot. Nothing. It might as well have been welded shut. In her growing panic, she began yelling for her 2 backup HOA board members, Rick and Teresa, but they had wisely decided to stay outside the fence, peeking in from a safe distance. Watching the footage from his phone, Marcus almost felt bad. Almost. The way Karen banged on the hatch door, shouting about civil rights and HOA authority, was the kind of spectacle we usually only saw on bad reality TV shows. Marcus decided it was time to go home, but he wasn't going to rush. No, He wanted Karen to fully experience the consequences of her entitlement. He got into his truck at a leisurely pace, even stopped at the local gas station for a drink, all while the shelter system dutifully recorded Karen's every hysterical word and move. Meanwhile, the storm clouds blackened the sky, and the first raindrops began to fall thick and heavy. The smell of ozone filled the air, adding an extra layer of urgency to the scene. As Marcus finally pulled into his driveway, he spotted Rick and Teresa huddled under a patio umbrella across the street, looking like guilty kids who had dared each other to ring a doorbell and run away. They waved awkwardly but said nothing. Marcus gave them a slow nod before walking calmly to the hatch control panel disguised as a tool shed. He tapped into the security feed, turned up the speaker, and let Karen's ranting fill the air. "This is unlawful imprisonment. I demand immediate release," she screeched, pounding on the inner door. Marcus leaned into the mic and said as casually as if he were ordering takeout, "You are trespassing on a federally protected emergency facility. Please remain calm. Authorities have been notified." The scream that erupted from Karen's lungs could have shattered glass. Even Marcus winced a little, but he couldn't suppress the grin spreading across his face. He hadn't even called the cops yet, but he was about to. This was going to be one for the books. As the storm sirens began wailing in the distance, Marcus realized the true poetry of the moment. Karen, who had spent years lording her fake authority over the neighborhood, was now utterly powerless, trapped by her own arrogance, and about to face not just neighborhood gossip, but real legal consequences. The thunder rumbled above like laughter from the heavens as Marcus dialed the sheriff's office, imagining how deliciously awkward the official report was going to be. And this was only the beginning. Marcus stood by the disguised control shed, listening to the wailing storm sirens blending almost musically with Karen's indignant yells echoing up from beneath the lawn. His hand hovered briefly over the manual override switch, but he didn't touch it. He knew exactly what he was doing. Letting the situation marinate just a little longer wasn't cruel. It was just letting natural consequences unfold in their purest form. After all, Karen had broken in on her own, ignored all the signs, bypassed every boundary set for her safety, and now she was experiencing the unfiltered results of her entitlement. Marcus could practically hear his lawyer's voice in his head, chuckling and reminding him once again how airtight his permits and security measures were. Pulling out his phone, Marcus finally made the call to the sheriff's department, calmly reporting an unlawful break-in to a federally subsidized emergency facility. The dispatcher's tone sharpened instantly, promising immediate dispatch of deputies and a federal investigator for damage assessment. This was no longer a petty HOA squabble. It was officially government business now. Inside the shelter, Karen had cycled through every stage of emotional meltdown. She had started with anger, pounding on the hatch and threatening lawsuits. Then she moved into bargaining, pleading through the security intercom for someone to just let her out and nobody would get in trouble. Now she was squarely in the panic phase, spinning in frantic circles around the small but well-equipped room. The shelter was stocked with bottled water, first aid kits, oxygen systems, and months' worth of emergency rations, but none of it seemed to comfort her. Her flashlight had long since slipped from her sweaty hands, clattering against the reinforced floor as she fumbled uselessly at the steel walls, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Meanwhile, outside, the wind picked up. Tree branches whipped across the street, and fat drops of rain exploded against the pavement. Neighbors began to trickle out onto their porches, peeking from behind windows, clutching coffee mugs and camera phones alike. Word was spreading quickly that something dramatic was unfolding at Marcus's place. A few people Marcus barely knew waved at him from across the street, offering knowing looks that said everything. Karen was finally getting exactly what she deserved, and the whole neighborhood couldn't wait to see how it ended. Marcus greeted them politely but kept his focus on the growing scene around his house. Rick and Teresa, Karen's supposed backup team, were still awkwardly lingering near the sidewalk, whispering urgently to each other, their faces pale with regret. Marcus caught their eyes, raised an eyebrow, and gestured casually at the shelter entrance as if asking, "Care to explain yourselves?" They immediately looked away, pretending to be fascinated by the storm clouds rolling in, 15 minutes later, two sheriff's department SUVs pulled up, their lights slicing through the increasing gloom. Four deputies climbed out, professional but visibly curious given the unusual nature of the call. Marcus met them at the curb, offering a full packet of documentation: permits, installation receipts, security footage timestamps, even a copy of the federal grant paperwork. The lead deputy, a stocky man with a humorless face, flipped through the papers quickly, nodding with increasing approval. He asked a few technical questions about the shelter systems, then finally smiled. A dry, restrained sort of smile that suggested he had seen a lot of dumb criminals, but this one was going to be special. "So let me get this straight," the deputy said, glancing up at the heavy clouds. "She cut her way into your private, federally protected storm shelter during an active storm warning and got herself locked inside." Marcus shrugged modestly, barely suppressing his grin. "That's about the size of it." The deputy shook his head slowly. "And you have footage?" Marcus tapped his phone, pulling up a live feed. Karen's shrill voice erupted from the speakers, demanding bottled water that wasn't expired and threatening to call the governor. The deputy let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. He turned to his fellow officers. "Go on, boys. Let's get her out before she files an incident report against the atmosphere." Approaching the hatch, the deputies tapped the speaker system to try and calm Karen down. "Ma'am, this is the sheriff's department. Please remain calm. We're working on getting you out." Karen, upon hearing the word sheriff, immediately shifted into a new gear of hysteria. She screamed about unlawful imprisonment, discrimination, and conspiracies, not realizing she was doing herself absolutely no favors. Her voice cracked as she added that she was performing a civic inspection, which earned a few barely concealed chuckles from the deputies. Marcus leaned against his truck, arms folded, thoroughly enjoying the show. It was one thing to get petty revenge. It was another thing entirely to watch your longtime antagonist professionally self-destruct in real time. After some brief deliberation, the officers decided to manually override the internal lock, a process Marcus had designed specifically for emergencies like tornado rescues, not clueless trespassers. It took a couple of minutes, but finally, the heavy door creaked open against the wind, and Karen stumbled out like a disoriented mole, blinking against the rain and struggling to maintain her dignity. Her hair was plastered against her forehead, her live, laugh, love t-shirts soaked through, her sandals squelching pathetically on the wet grass. She immediately launched into a tirade about her authority and right to inspect, jabbing her finger at Marcus accusingly. Before she could spiral further, the deputy calmly stepped between them, holding up a hand. "Ma'am," he said, voice clipped and cold, "you are under investigation for unlawful entry, tampering with protected emergency infrastructure, and potentially filing false reports. Please place your hands where I can see them." The shift in Karen's expression was almost cartoonish. She opened her mouth to argue but quickly realized this was not a situation where talking would dig her out of the hole. Two deputies gently but firmly cuffed her hands behind her back while reading her rights, and for the first time in recorded neighborhood history, Karen was blessedly, gloriously silent as she was led toward the patrol car, her damp, squelching footsteps matching the rhythmic patter of rain. Rick and Teresa tried to slink away unnoticed. Marcus caught them at the edge of his driveway. He gave them a polite, razor-sharp smile and said, just loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "Don't worry, folks. There's still plenty of room in the shelter if anyone else wants to inspect it." A ripple of laughter rolled through the neighbors, cutting through the tension of the storm. Marcus didn't even flinch when a nearby bolt of lightning lit up the sky. Somehow, everything felt perfectly, poetically aligned, and he knew, deep down, that the real storm, for Karen, was just beginning. The storm hit full force just as the deputies secured Karen inside the patrol car. Rain lashed sideways across the street, turning the neatly manicured lawns into rivers of mud. The wind howled around the houses, tugging at loose shingles and sending trash cans skittering down the road like awkward race cars. Marcus stood under the overhang of his porch, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. It was fitting, he thought, that nature itself seemed to be celebrating Karen's downfall. As neighbors gathered under umbrellas and in doorways, whispering and gawking, the full magnitude of what Karen had done began to ripple outward. This wasn't just another one of her petty crusades about lawn heights or mailbox colors. She had broken into federal infrastructure during an emergency alert, endangered herself, lied about her authority, and humiliated the entire HOA leadership by dragging them into it. Inside the patrol car, Karen was still struggling to process the disaster she had triggered. Her face, visible through the rain-speckled window, was a mask of disbelief and fury. She mouthed words at Marcus as he stood watching, words that looked suspiciously like empty threats, but the heavy sheets of rain drowned out everything. The absurdity of it all almost made Marcus laugh, but he knew better than to drop his guard. Karen's troublemaking wasn't over yet. It was morphing into something bigger, something more dangerous for her and potentially for anyone foolish enough to still support her. The deputies convened near Marcus's shelter, their radios crackling with updates from dispatch. Another emergency alert sounded from nearby phones, a shrill tone that sent a fresh wave of tension through the already chaotic scene. A tornado had touched down about 15 miles away, heading in their general direction. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus or anyone else watching. While Karen had been busy manufacturing a crisis, a real one was bearing down on them fast. One of the deputies pulled Marcus aside and spoke low enough that the gathering crowd couldn't hear. The officer explained that since Karen had broken into a federal disaster shelter, a formal investigation would be opened by the State Emergency Management Office and possibly even FEMA. They would need Marcus's full security footage, all his documentation, and any communications he had received from the HOA or Karen regarding the shelter. Marcus nodded, already knowing he had kept meticulous records. Before they could continue, another figure appeared at the edge of the crowd, shielding herself with a battered umbrella. It was Mrs. Henderson, one of the oldest residents in the subdivision and, surprisingly, one of Karen's oldest critics. She waddled up to the deputies and Marcus, planting herself firmly in the mud. In a voice that cut through the storm like a blade, she declared that she had seen Karen plotting earlier that morning, overheard her bragging to Rick and Teresa that she would find something illegal on Marcus's property, even if she had to make it up. The deputies took immediate interest, pulling Mrs. Henderson aside for a formal statement. Marcus watched with a sense of deep satisfaction as the pieces continued falling into place. Karen hadn't just made a mistake. She had orchestrated a premeditated act of trespassing and sabotage, and now witnesses were lining up to say so. Across the street, Rick and Teresa were fidgeting nervously under the awning of Teresa's house. It didn't take long before the deputies decided to invite them over for a few words too. Marcus caught snippets of the conversation as he sipped from a thermos of coffee, the storm's fury lessening just enough to carry voices across the yard. Rick stammered out that they hadn't known Karen was going to actually break in, that they thought it was just going to be a visual check from the sidewalk. Teresa, for her part, looked ready to cry, clutching her clipboard like it could shield her from impending legal doom. When pressed about whether they knew Karen had brought tools and intended to enter the shelter physically, neither could meet the deputy's eyes. As the interviews wrapped up, the lead deputy approached Marcus once more. He informed Marcus that Karen would be facing multiple charges, including criminal trespass, tampering with emergency equipment, and interfering with a federally designated disaster site. He also hinted that depending on how the federal agencies weighed in, more severe penalties could be added. Marcus nodded, feeling a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying finally lift off his shoulders. For too long, Karen's harassment had felt like an endless game he was being forced to play. Now the rules had changed. Now she was playing against people who didn't care about her HOA title or her self-important bluster. She was facing real accountability. Just as Marcus was beginning to think the evening couldn't get any stranger, another surprise rolled up his driveway. A sleek black SUV with government plates pulled in behind the patrol cars, its windshield wipers slashing back and forth. Two men and a woman stepped out, dressed in dark windbreakers marked FEMA. The federal agents introduced themselves briskly and got straight to work, inspecting the shelter, reviewing Marcus's permits, and pulling security footage from the external drives. Their presence added an extra layer of seriousness to the already tense scene. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and half-closed doors, whispering about the black SUVs and government agents now descending on their quiet suburban cul-de-sac. The agents were all business, asking detailed questions about the shelter's design, security features, and history of HOA conflicts. Marcus answered everything honestly, even showing them the log files from the motion sensors and door lock. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense air, nodded approvingly as she reviewed the data. She pointed out that because Marcus's shelter had been partially funded by federal disaster grants, tampering with it wasn't just a local crime. It could be prosecuted under federal emergency protection laws. That meant Karen could be facing far worse than just community service or a slap on the wrist. It could mean hefty fines, a criminal record, even jail time. As the agents finished up and prepared to leave, one of them turned to Marcus and, in a rare moment of dry humor, said, "Next time someone complains about your shelter, just remind them it's the safest place in town. And they should be grateful they're not locked inside." Marcus laughed quietly, the sound swallowed by the diminishing wind. He knew this storm, both literal and metaphorical, was far from over. Karen's arrest was just the beginning. There would be fallout, finger-pointing, desperate attempts to shift blame, maybe even lawsuits. But Marcus wasn't worried anymore. He had everything he needed: the truth, the proof, and a community that was finally starting to see Karen for what she truly was. As the rain lightened to a mist and the flashing lights of the patrol cars faded into the distance, Marcus turned and walked back toward his house, feeling the solid, comforting thud of the storm shelter door locking securely behind him. The next morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed with stories, half-truths, and stunned laughter about what had happened at Marcus's property. Marcus himself woke to a dozen text messages from neighbors, a few news alerts, and an email from his lawyer marked urgent, but with a distinct undertone of triumph. The local news had already gotten wind of the story. It wasn't every day that a suburban HOA scandal involved federal agents, a high-tech storm shelter, and the arrest of a woman known for citing people over the color of their porch lights. As Marcus sipped his coffee on the porch, he watched as cars slowed to a crawl in front of his house, neighbors pretending to admire the trees while trying to get a glimpse of whatever federal drama had unfolded overnight. Some waved sheepishly when he caught them staring. Others gave enthusiastic thumbs-ups, clearly rooting for him. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Marcus felt like he wasn't fighting the tide alone. It didn't take long for the HOA board to start unraveling. By noon, Rick and Teresa had sent out a frantic community-wide email distancing themselves from Karen's actions. They framed it as a rogue operation, claiming they had no knowledge that Karen intended to forcibly enter Marcus's property and that they deeply respected the rights of homeowners. Marcus read the email twice, laughing to himself at how quickly loyalty crumbled when consequences came knocking. His amusement was short-lived, though, because attached to the email was a summons for an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for that evening. The agenda was crystal clear, addressing recent events and leadership accountability. Karen's name was glaringly absent, which said everything about how fast they were trying to erase her from the picture. Marcus debated whether to attend but decided he had no reason not to. If anything, he wanted to see how deep the rabbit hole of Karen's deception went. He spent the afternoon gathering every bit of documentation he had accumulated over the years, every passive-aggressive email, every nonsensical fine, every ridiculous compliance notice she had sent him. He even printed screenshots of group messages where Karen openly bragged about making life difficult for homeowners who didn't fall in line with her vision. By the time evening fell, Marcus had a thick folder tucked under one arm and a cool, unbothered look on his face. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a place that usually hosted baby showers and bland board meetings. Tonight, it had the electric tension of a courtroom drama. Nearly every resident showed up, cramming into folding chairs and whispering loudly. Some people clearly came for entertainment, others for justice. The remaining few, mostly Karen loyalists, looked deeply uncomfortable. Rick and Teresa sat stiffly at the front table, their faces pinched and sweaty. An empty chair sat between them, the intended seat for Karen, who, as everyone knew, was otherwise occupied at the county jail pending her arraignment. Rick cleared his throat and tried to open the meeting with some generic words about community values and unforeseen misunderstandings. He didn't get far. Hands shot up across the room. Voices rose. People demanded answers. How had this been allowed to happen? Why had the HOA leadership tolerated Karen's behavior for so long? Why were dues being spent on legal consultations for problems Karen had created? Every question was sharper than the last, and Rick and Teresa looked like they were shrinking by the minute. When Marcus's turn came to speak, he didn't shout. He didn't need to. He walked slowly to the front of the room, set his thick folder on the table with a satisfying thud, and calmly explained everything. He detailed the legitimate permits for his storm shelter, the federal grants involved, the security footage showing Karen breaking in, and the timeline of her increasingly hostile actions. Then he handed out copies of the evidence, watching the faces of the crowd shift from angry curiosity to pure outrage as they read Karen's own words boasting about targeting homeowners. Murmurs filled the room. A few people audibly gasped. It became crystal clear that Karen's behavior hadn't just been a personal vendetta against Marcus. It was part of a pattern. A long, ugly pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. By the time Marcus finished, even the most stubborn Karen defenders were avoiding eye contact with the rest of the room. Rick, sweating visibly, tried to regain control by promising new elections and a full transparency initiative. But the damage was done. A motion was immediately raised and seconded to remove the entire board, pending a full investigation, and before Rick could finish stammering objections, the room voted overwhelmingly in favor. As Marcus returned to his seat, a few neighbors clapped quietly. Then more joined until the whole room echoed with applause. Marcus didn't bask in it. He simply nodded, knowing that the victory wasn't about pride. It was about survival. The survival of a neighborhood that had almost been strangled by one woman's obsession with control. Outside the clubhouse, as people poured into the cool night air, Marcus was approached by several neighbors he barely knew, but who all had similar things to say. They thanked him. They admitted they had been too afraid to stand up to Karen. They asked if he would consider joining the interim HOA leadership committee to help clean up the mess. Marcus didn't answer right away. He smiled politely, saying he would think about it. After all, he hadn't built a high-tech storm shelter just to get dragged into HOA politics full-time. As he walked back toward his truck, he noticed something that made him stop short. A small cluster of teenagers were standing on the sidewalk, holding up their phones and giggling. Curious, he approached and saw that they were looking at a brand-new addition to the fence near his property. Someone had attached a handmade wooden sign, beautifully carved and burned with precise letters. It read, "Warning. Unauthorized inspections may result in temporary detention. Hi, Karen." Beneath it was a cartoonish etching of Karen's furious face, complete with her signature oversized sunglasses and permanent frown. Marcus laughed out loud, the sound carrying through the night like a fresh breeze after a heavy storm. For once, he wasn't the target of neighborhood gossip or spite. For once, justice had landed exactly where it needed to. As the teens scattered and the neighbors slowly returned to their homes, Marcus leaned against his truck and took in the scene. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh starts. The sky was clear now, scattered with stars. And somewhere out there, Karen was sitting in a holding cell. No clipboard, no authority, no one left to boss around but herself. It was, Marcus thought with great satisfaction, a far better ending than he could have ever scripted. The days that followed felt like the neighborhood had been doused in fresh paint. People smiled more openly. Kids played freely without their parents, casting nervous glances at driveways. And there was a strange, almost festive energy humming through the community. Karen's house, once a command center for passive-aggressive notes and spontaneous inspections, sat dark and lifeless. A hastily printed, "For sale by owner" sign appeared in her front yard by the end of the week, skewed at an awkward angle, as if even the post had given up. Marcus watched it all unfold quietly from his porch, nursing a glass of iced tea and feeling the kind of peace he hadn't known since the day he first moved into the neighborhood. There was no gloating, no parades, just the simple, steady satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, without fanfare, the universe balanced the scales. News of Karen's arrest spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The story had gone viral, picked up by regional news outlets, and then catapulted into national headlines thanks to a social media post by someone's teenage nephew. Marcus found it surreal seeing drone footage of his storm shelter being dissected on cable news, complete with animated graphics showing Karen's disastrous entry and eventual capture. Headlines range from factual to hilarious, with one particularly popular meme labeling her the storm shelter bandit. Marcus's inbox filled with messages from strangers across the country, some offering legal advice, others simply sending messages of support. It was strange being turned into a symbol of standing up against entitled authority, but Marcus took it in stride. He hadn't asked for fame. All he wanted was to live quietly with his storm shelter untouched and his mornings free of unsolicited HOA mandates. As for the HOA, the emergency elections had come and gone with record turnout. For once, people who had long muttered frustrations behind closed doors stood up publicly. A new board was elected, composed mostly of homeowners who had been burned by Karen's reign of terror. They immediately introduced sweeping reforms, including a rule limiting the powers of any one board member and mandating an independent audit of HOA activities. Marcus stayed true to his word and declined any formal position, though he agreed to sit on an advisory committee focused on property rights and disaster preparedness. He figured if he could help steer things without becoming mired in the bureaucracy, it was worth it. One sunny Saturday, just as life was beginning to feel truly normal again, the neighborhood threw an informal barbecue at the park. It wasn't announced through stuffy newsletters or demanded through mandatory attendance notices like Karen used to do. It just happened the way good things do when people are left to their own devices. Families brought out grills, kids raced each other on scooters, and neighbors who had barely exchanged nods before now chatted like old friends. Marcus was dragged into several conversations about the shelter, everyone eager to hear firsthand how it had all gone down. He told the story with a modest shrug, focusing more on the absurdity of the situation than any personal victory. After all, the real win wasn't trapping Karen. It was the way the community had snapped out of its fear and remembered that neighborhoods are supposed to be lived in, not ruled over. As the evening wound down and the sky deepened into a watercolor of purples and golds, a few of Marcus's closer neighbors unveiled a surprise. They had commissioned a local woodworker to create a permanent sign for the entrance to his property, a replacement for the handmade one the teenagers had cobbled together. They presented it with dramatic fanfare, pulling off a red tarp to reveal a polished oak board, beautifully etched and lacquered to withstand the weather. It read, "Private property. Unauthorized entry may result in a complimentary lock-in. Have a nice day." Below the inscription was a small engraved image of a cartoon tornado chasing a frantic figure in oversized sunglasses. Marcus laughed until his sides hurt, genuinely touched by the gesture. He helped mount it just beside the path leading to the storm shelter, a small but unmistakable symbol of everything that had changed. Meanwhile, Karen's legal troubles were only just beginning. With federal investigators involved, the list of charges grew longer by the week: tampering with emergency equipment, criminal trespass, obstruction of federal disaster mitigation programs, and even a charge related to falsifying HOA records. All stacked up neatly like dominoes waiting to fall. Her lawyer, a weary-looking man spotted leaving the courthouse more than once with a migraine-inducing scowl, attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors weren't in a forgiving mood. Marcus didn't have to lift a finger. The machinery of justice was working just fine on its own. Rumor had it that Karen tried to sue the HOA itself for negligence, claiming they had failed to support her civic initiatives. The lawsuit was swiftly laughed out of court, and within days, her house was officially listed with a rock-bottom price tag, the real estate description notably avoiding any mention of her role in recent community events. The day the moving truck finally pulled up to her curb, Marcus didn't bother watching the chaos. He didn't need to. Some things were better left as the final punctuation mark on a story that had dragged on far too long. Instead, he spent the afternoon tinkering with upgrades to his shelter security system, not out of fear, but because he simply loved the work. For the first time, he could do it without the weight of constant harassment hovering over him. The neighborhood, now free of its tyrant, began to blossom. Front yards grew more colorful with homemade gardens. Block parties were organized without passive-aggressive RSVPs. Even small acts of kindness seemed to multiply, like the couple 2 streets over who started a weekend tool-sharing program, or the teenager who volunteered to mow elderly neighbors' lawns. It was like the entire subdivision had been holding its breath for years and was finally blissfully exhaling. Marcus sometimes caught himself smiling for no reason, a lightness in his chest he hadn't realized was missing until it returned. One evening, as he stood on his porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, Marcus reflected on everything that had happened. It wasn't about the shelter, the HOA, or even Karen. It was about freedom, the freedom to build a life, to protect what mattered, and to live without fear of petty tyranny disguised as community service. The storm that had once loomed so large had passed, leaving behind stronger roots, clearer skies, and a neighborhood that remembered what it meant to stand together. And as the stars blinked into view one by one, Marcus smiled, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. And this time, nobody could take that away from him.